Imagine walking down a stone corridor lit by trembling candles. The air is thick, scented with sweet incense, and slightly metallic. The silence is not absolute. It breathes, it whispers, it watches. You are in an ancient palace, an empire that no longer exists, but whose secrets remain alive, buried beneath polished marble and golden tapestries. For centuries, history has told that emperors chose their wives for love, for beauty, for political agreements between great houses, a noble gesture, a bond between families, a public ceremony celebrated before the people. But what if this version is just a curtain? And what if, behind the glamour, there was something much older and darker? In forgotten records, there are whispers of a ritual, a secret ritual, an ancestral test, a path of no return. It was called the Black Rose, a name never spoken aloud and always written in red ink like dried blood. 7 women entered, only one came out, the new empress, chosen not for desire, but for resistance, for silence, for fear. No one spoke of what happened in the chamber, and those who tried vanished. Today, the empire of Thalion is buried under centuries of dust. Its columns are cracked, its crowns oxidized. But the ritual? Some say it never ceased. It just hid itself better. Over the next few minutes, you will get to know the backstage of this empire. You will walk through corridors where the walls seem to listen. You will descend stairs where the air grows colder, and perhaps you will understand the true price of being an empress. Don't expect romance, nor fairy tales, just silence and a black rose. For over 4 centuries, Thalion was the beating heart of the East, a vast, golden empire built on conquests and silence. Its armies were feared, its laws absolute, its court a carefully rehearsed theater. But the true power of Thalion was not in its swords, nor in its crowns. It was in its rituals. Since the time of the first dynasty, the emperors cultivated practices inherited from forgotten lineages. They mixed religion, magic, and politics in ceremonies that took place far from the people's eyes. For them, dominion was not just physical, it was spiritual, and every important decision was preceded by a rite. The most sacred of all was the choice of the empress. Outwardly, it was said she was selected from noble families after long analyses of genealogy, blood purity, and diplomatic skill. A formal event announced months in advance. Inside, it was very different. The emperor was not just the ruler. He was considered the embodiment of the ancestral will, a link between the world of the living and the world of those who came before. His word was law, his silence a sentence. But he did not reign alone. The empress had a hidden role. It was said that she was the guardian of the spiritual connection between the throne and the underworld, that her presence maintained the balance between glory and disgrace. Therefore, it was not enough to be beautiful or obedient. It was necessary to resist. The Black Rose ritual was performed beneath the palace, far from the official ceremonies. And its existence was denied by everyone, even by the emperors themselves. Recent documents reveal that with each new coronation, 7 young women were chosen for spiritual retreat. No one saw them for weeks. When they returned, if they returned, they were different, and only one sat on the throne. Most people believe that rituals begin on the appointed day, but the ritual of the Black Rose began long before. The chosen young women were not summoned by luck or influence. They were shaped from childhood for a role they would never fully understand. The selection began at the age of 6, when priests disguised as tutors visited remote villages, looking for girls with a specific profile: easy silence, a fixed gaze, an absence of tears. Those who were taken never returned. They spent years in seclusion, in convents that did not pray. Their days were filled with training, maintaining posture for hours without moving, enduring the cold without complaining, controlling their heartbeats with only their breath. They were taught not to react, not to ask, not to desire. Identity was slowly erased. Their names were replaced by numbers, their clothes standardized, their emotional reflexes hardened. It was said that the true empress was not chosen. She was revealed by the absence of noise, by obedience in the face of the inexplicable, by the ability to endure the invisible without breaking. When they turned 18, the 7 candidates were taken to the palace of Theralis, but they did not enter through the main door. They went through the back, with veils on their faces and ropes on their wrists. For 7 days, they remained isolated in separate chambers. They did not speak. They did not eat. They received only water, and the occasional visit of a hooded figure who just watched, in absolute silence. The sound of footsteps was the only reminder that they were still alive. Ancient accounts from monks who recorded in secret describe strange episodes. One of the young women smiled alone, for no apparent reason. Another pulled out her own hair at night. A third slept all the time as if fleeing from reality. But what was most repeated in the texts was the same dream, shared by all, even without contact between them. That of a dark corridor, where a black rose floated in the air with living eyes on each petal. On the 8th day, at dawn, they were led to the Chamber of Roses, barefoot, and their minds already broken. The Chamber of Roses was not just a room, it was a secret carved in stone. Located beneath the west wing of the Theralis Palace, it was accessed by a narrow staircase carved directly into the rock. There were no windows, no visible doors from the outside, only a heavy wooden trapdoor, locked from the inside. Upon descending, the air changed. It became dense, humid, slightly sweet, as if flowers were rotting somewhere unseen. The temperature dropped, and the silence was not empty. It vibrated, as if something there breathed along. The space was circular, with walls covered in dark red velvet tapestries. In the center, a golden symbol drawn on the floor, a rose whose petals formed hypnotic spirals, each with an eye embedded in its center. Iron chandeliers, attached to chains descending from the ceiling, illuminated the room with weak, flickering flames. The floor was of polished black stone, cold to the touch, always slightly damp, as if the chamber itself were weeping. On the periphery of the room, 7 marble pedestals, and on each a black rose. Real, alive, but without perfume, as if it were beautiful, and at the same time, dead. The 7 young women entered one by one, always in silence, always with their eyes lowered. A priest led them to the pedestals. They received the rose, and then the ritual began. There were no words, no instructions. just the presence of 7 hooded figures watching from the shadows. They were called the witnesses. They never spoke. They never moved. The ritual was internal. The trials did not come from outside. They came from the mind. The young women were exposed to inexplicable sounds, sudden lights, abrupt changes in temperature. Some reports mention whispers coming from the walls, familiar voices calling each candidate by her real name, names that had been forgotten for years. Some cried, others screamed, many fainted, but one always remained motionless, without speaking, without reacting, with the rose still firm in her hands. She was the one chosen. The empress crowned at the end of the ceremony received no praise, no hugs. She was led to a new room, a new silence, a new prison. Some did not speak for weeks. Others, never again. And yet, they were seen as the strongest, the most worthy, the only ones who survived. The official history of the Empire of Theralis does not mention disappearances. In public records, all women involved in the process of choosing the empress were treated as anonymous servants and declared as secluded in convents or married to distant officials. No name, no face, no confirmation. But in surviving letters, hidden for centuries in the walls of noble houses, unsettling mentions appear. Families report the sudden disappearance of daughters. They ask for answers, plead for news, and receive only silence in return. Some mothers write about premonitions, recurring dreams of blood and eyes. Others claim to have seen their daughters in the palace courtyard, but only at a glance, in silent nocturnal processions, with veiled faces and steps that were too slow. On 3 occasions, the people murmured about accidents. Large fires consumed entire areas of the palace. One of them, mysteriously, started exactly in the West Underground, the location associated, albeit informally, with the Chamber of Roses. No deaths were officially recorded, but dozens of maids disappeared on the same night, and the names of the young women chosen for the ritual erased. In all documents, there is only a black stroke where ink once was. Among the few who dared to speak about what happened in the palace's underground are the invisible ones. Maids, night guards, illiterate servants who left oral accounts recorded years later, when Theralis was already crumbling. An old sentinel, interviewed in 1903, described hearing light taps on the walls during the early morning. Not like hammer blows, like fingernails. He said that sometimes the walls groaned, and that when he passed by the chamber door, he smelled earth and something else. Iron, flesh, fear. A maid mentioned seeing a young woman leave the chamber staircase in a catatonic state. Her eyes open, her mouth stained with blood. She walked alone, but her whole body was trembling. She was taken away by soldiers. She was never seen again. And a priest, the only one who tried to stop the ritual, disappeared 3 days after writing in his diary, "They are not chosen, they are sacrificed." After that, his cell was found empty, the bed unmade, and on the wall, someone had drawn a black rose with their fingers. In 1897, Dr. Émile Garel, a French physician interested in ancient medicine and Oriental anatomical rituals, was invited to visit the ruins of the old palace of Theralis. At the time, the place was a decaying tourist spot, maintained by local guides and a few guards. He was looking for manuscripts, but he found something else. The accounts are fragmented, but the records of the French embassy in Istanbul confirm that Garel disappeared for 3 days during his visit. When he was found, he was wandering the dirty streets of the city, with torn clothes, sunken eyes, and a fixed expression. He spoke disconnected words in French and Latin, as if reciting a mass or begging for forgiveness. After weeks of hospitalization, he began to write compulsively. A 43-page diary where he described having accidentally entered through a side passage of the palace, following a sweet smell coming from the stones. The staircase was irregular, hidden behind a broken shelf. He claims to have descended for long minutes, feeling the temperature gradually drop. Down below, he found a round room. The walls were covered with faded tapestries, and in the center was a chair of aged gold, covered with scratch marks and dried blood. But that's not what destroyed him. According to the diary, he heard voices, not screams, not words, just sounds, low, long, interminable, like laments trapped in the fabric of the curtains, breathing through the walls, sounds that asked for silence. He wrote, "The rose has eyes, and it looks inside us. None of them had a choice. None of them screamed, because there, even sound dies." Decades later, in 2021, a team of Turkish archaeologists was working on the foundations of an abandoned library on the outskirts of the former territory of Theralis. During excavations, they removed a false wall, revealing another made of black, perfectly polished stone. In the center, in high relief, the symbol, a black rose, and on each petal, eyes. Human eyes, spherical, carved with such precision that they seemed alive, watching, judging. Experts tried to dissociate the finding from folklore. They said it was just a floral ritualistic symbol with no direct relation to any imperial cult. But local residents began to avoid the place. Tour guides abandoned their posts, and during the nights, old stories began to circulate again. Whispers, visions, shared nightmares, as if the rose were still alive, waiting, silent, watching who dares to remember. Those who returned from the Chamber of Roses, if they returned at all, were no longer the same. The empress crowned at the end of the ritual always appeared accompanied by priests, wrapped in heavy cloaks, her face veiled. It was said that the light would hurt her eyes, or that the world no longer interested her. The court chronicles, carefully censored, describe these women vaguely: serene, secluded, spiritually elevated. But accounts preserved by servants and scribes speak of empty eyes, absent smiles, and sleepless nights, in which the empress would just sit in absolute silence, staring at the wall for hours, without blinking. An old palace maid reportedly confided that a certain empress spent 2 years without saying a single word. Another never smiled. There is also the case of Anira, the 4th wife of Emperor Calum II, who never left her quarters after the ceremony. Her diary, composed of repetitive lines and irregular strokes, ends with the sentence, "I stayed, but I did not return." The people said the throne transformed, but those who knew the chamber knew it consumed. The Empress, according to the mystical records of the Order of the Rose, was not just a wife. She was the seal, the shield, the guardian between two worlds, the visible and the veiled. Her function, though unstated, was clear to those who understood the symbols. She kept the ritual intact within herself. It was said that by enduring the absolute silence of the chamber, the woman absorbed something, an ancient essence, a fragment of power, perhaps, or a living memory of all who had fallen before her. The Empress did not rule. She watched over. In public meetings, her presence was discreet. She never opined, she never contradicted. She was regarded as a sacred ornament, but some called her a sentinel. And when an empress died, the palace would fall into total silence for 7 days. Not even the bells would toll. It was the time necessary, they said, for her echo to dissipate from the corridors, and for the ritual to begin again. No one knew what happened to their bodies. No empress was ever buried publicly. The only certainty is that, upon being crowned, she received 2 things: a golden crown and a black rose. With the fall of the Thalion Empire, it was expected that its secrets would crumble along with its walls, but some mysteries do not collapse. They settle in the shadows, adapt, and continue. Genealogical records indicate that several noble families connected to the original court dispersed after the official dissolution of the empire. Some disappeared completely. Others strangely became wealthy. And a small group, discreet yet influential, maintained unusual habits. In 1952, an anonymous letter sent to an academic journal mentioned a new chamber hidden under a mansion in the mountains of Cappadocia. According to the report, girls between 12 and 18 were sent to an initiation retreat that lasted 7 days with no external communication. The place was described as cold, silent, and scented with dark flowers. The letter was never published, but copies still circulate among occult groups. In 1998, a Hungarian anthropologist claimed to have been hired to catalog ceremonial objects from a traditional family in the Bulgarian countryside. Among the items, she found a chair carved with eyes on the sides and black petals embedded in metal. When she questioned her hosts, she was escorted off the property. She abandoned the research and never gave interviews again. Today, it's easy to disbelieve, to say it's all a legend, a Gothic tale adapted for entertainment. But there are still signs. Discreet, uncomfortable, persistent. Graffiti of black roses with eyes appear in Eastern European cities, always near old administrative buildings, some in girls' schools, others in decommissioned churches. In all of them, the eyes seem to be watching. No group claims authorship. Once, in a closed deep web forum, a message appeared. She has been chosen. The silence continues. Shortly after, the forum went offline, and all profiles were deleted. The symbol of the black rose with eyes has been recorded in at least 3 different locations in the last decade, each thousands of kilometers from the other. All followed the same carving pattern. No artist claimed authorship. And in 2023, a young woman disappeared in Istanbul after telling a friend, "I dreamed of eyes on the petals. They called me by my name." The case was closed without a solution. The black rose does not wither. It just waits for the next one and stays alive in the silence. Not every prison is made of bars. Some are made of silence. For centuries, The ritual of the black rose was presented as a process of spiritual elevation. But when the symbolic ornamentation is stripped away, what remains is simple and brutal. A woman placed before the obligation to obey, to resist, to accept, without understanding, without being able to refuse. She does not choose. She is chosen. Or worse, she is molded not to know how to say no. The black rose, in this context, was never a flower. It was a wordless contract, a pact sealed not with ink, but with fear. Whoever accepted the rose accepted to disappear, not from the world, but from herself. History calls her empress, but what did she reign over? A symbolic throne, a palace of echoes, a name carved in gold with no voice to pronounce it. The few who escaped, or went mad trying, left traces of pain masked as glory, coded texts, disturbing paintings, silences that were too long. The power in the end was never theirs, it was over them. And now, so many centuries later, the empire has turned to ruin. The crowns are kept in museums, the tapestries dusty, the halls empty, but the rose still exists in symbols, in dreams, in stories that no one dares to tell aloud. It survives like any well-written curse, quiet, hidden, functional. You might think it's just a myth, that women don't disappear anymore, that no ancient ritual has survived modern reason, but the disappearances have changed form. They have become invisible, no longer through the undergrounds of palaces, but through the labyrinths of the mind itself. How many are still molded to obey? How many silently carry a rose they never asked for? The black rose is the image of a choice that was never offered, of a silence imposed even before the first word, of a tradition that insists on not dying, and it waits, patiently, deep in the earth or deep in the consciousness. If one day someone offers you a dark, cold, beautiful, and silent rose, before accepting it, ask yourself, do you know what it wants from you? Or is it already too late? The legends of Thalion should have dissolved with the centuries, but the age of cameras and satellites has merely swapped scrolls for pixels. In 2007, a night guard at a museum in Ankara reported seeing on the surveillance screens a female figure crossing the Byzantine art wing. She wore a dark cloak, carrying something that looked like a flower. When the man ran to intercept, he found nothing but a sweet and metallic scent. The recording? It disappeared from the server the next morning, replaced by silent static. Similar cases pop up in digital vigilante forums, shadows that glide without triggering motion sensors, whispers picked up by external microphones even when there is no wind. In all of them, the same description: a veiled woman and the faint scent of freshly cut black petals. The black rose has migrated from stone corridors to source code. Anonymous profiles on X, TikTok, and even LinkedIn display the emblem with eyes on the petals, usually accompanied by enigmatic dates, always 7 days before the disappearance of some young woman. In 2016, a reverse engineering group traced one of these profiles to an offshore server. Everything was encrypted except for a folder named Silence. Inside, a single 7-minute audio file, slowing cardiovascular beats, interspersed with a female breath that never reaches a final sigh. The file went viral, but strangely, All re-uploads suffered checksum failures and slowly corrupted, as if the sound itself refused to survive on the surface of the web. With each attempt to decipher, the suspicion grows. The Black Rose has adapted. It now flourishes in the invisibility of data packets, feeding on the fear that travels between one click and another. For centuries, voices fell silent before tradition. But every ritual depends on someone's belief. In 2024, a collective of Turkish female historians launched the Silentia Project, cross-referencing genealogical records, lost diaries, and DNA samples preserved in abandoned convents. They discovered that if the rose chooses by resistance to sound, perhaps the antidote is not the scream, but acknowledgement. To name the disappeared, to tell their stories, to give them back their identity. Public reading ceremonies were organized in 7 cities, candles lit, walls covered with projections of forgotten faces. For each name pronounced, a deliberate 7-second silence, not to honor fear, but to pierce it. And something curious happened. In the same week, graffiti of black roses withered, covered by white paint. Some claim to have felt, for the first time, the air of the old palace become light, without the sweet metallic scent. History teaches that curses only endure as long as they find fertile ground. The Rallis collapsed because its walls could not bear the weight of the echoes. Now the challenge is not to rebuild those walls within the modern mind. The Black Rose may survive in cinematic myths, in augmented reality games, in conspiracy theories, but if each new generation treats the myth as a warning, not a destiny, perhaps the petals will lose their color. There are initiatives to transform the palace's underground into a memorial. Corridors illuminated by soft light, respecting the cold that resides there, but filled with recordings of the visits themselves, laughter, voices, life. Where there was once only silence, there will be sound. And if the whisper returns to wander the stones, may it find echoes of resistance, not of fear. For every rose, no matter how dark, needs light to stay alive. Without light, it finally ceases to bloom.